So recently, I had an author reach out to me and offer to send a sample of a work that he had just finished and asked my thoughts if I'd take a look at it. And if I found it interesting, maybe share about it with Disciple Dojo viewers. And I said, I'm happy to. Send me whatever you'd like me to take a look at, and I'll give my honest response. So I received this copy in the mail of the Biblia cum glossa ordinaria. In this video, I'm just going to refer to it as the glossa. It's the great medieval commentary on sacred scripture for Genesis. Now, I'm not a historic theologian, and medieval biblical interpretation is probably the area of study that I'm the least familiar with, if I'm being honest. And so before reading this, I honestly had not ever specifically heard of the glossa. But as I've learned, it is one of the most influential medieval Christian interpretive tools that are out there. The problem is it's in Latin. So what Dr. Klumpenhauer has done is translated the text of the glossa on the book of Genesis into English. And I think rather than just explaining it, it'll be easier if I show you what it is and what it looks like so you can get a feel for it. This dust jacket is really glossy, but it's also kind of loud when you hold it up. So set that aside for now. And this is a really nice volume. I mean, just on the shelf, this looks really nice. The quality is very good. It's sturdy. And let me show you what it actually is. So when you open it up, after the title page, this is by Emmaus Academic, you come to a preface, and the preface tells about the glossa, what it is, why it was important, and why Dr. Klumpenhauer decided it was time for an English translation. Then there's a facsimile of what the original printed glossa looked like. And I'll hold it up so the camera can get a better view. But you had the text of scripture in Latin, the Latin Vulgate here. And then throughout, there were these tiny notations, just brief annotations that went along with the text in line. And then surrounding it on these two columns were longer explanations from various medieval interpreters about the meanings of the passages. And I say the meanings because medieval interpretation believed there were many meanings in the text. There was just the literal meaning, like the historical meaning, what we would consider today biblical interpretation. Each passage also had an allegorical meaning. Each passage had a tropological meaning, and each passage had an analogical meaning. Different senses in the way the text could be read and insights could be gleaned from scripture. So Klumpenhauer's goal, it seems, is to make this readable and available, at least for the book of Genesis, not for all of Scripture, but for Genesis, to English readers for the first time. Klumpenhauer's PhD was in medieval studies from the University of Toronto, and he talks about in the preface how his own reading of the glossa was spiritually nourishing and very insightful, and he thought that this stuff needs to be available to people who can't read Latin, to a wider audience. So there's a brief introduction to the history of the glossa, the origins of it, who were some of the contributors, how do we know what textual traditions, because this was done before the printing press. This was medieval works where they would have to actually hand copy it. So a volume of this size was monumentally expensive, but it was put together in the 12th century, and it's largely anonymous. There's no certainty on who the actual compilers were. Then there's a section on medieval exegesis that explains the different meanings that medieval exegetes would try to read from the text. And so there's an excerpt here that says there are 4 rules of sacred scripture: the historical, which speaks of past matters; the allegorical, in which one thing is understood from another; the tropological, namely moral speech, which deals with properly ordered behavior; and the analogical, namely the spiritual understanding through which we are led from high and celestial things to even higher things. These 4 rules are like wheels that turn all of Holy Scripture. For example, Jerusalem is a city, according to the historical rule. According to the allegorical rule, it signifies the church. According to the tropological, that is moral, it signifies the soul whose fidelity yearns for eternal peace. According to the analogical, it signifies the life of all celestial beings who see God with an unveiled face. So whether or not you believe that any of these are valid ways of interpreting the text or not, these were norms that medieval interpreters read the text through such lenses. And so to understand the history of biblical interpretation, to understand the history of some would even argue Western civilization, we have to know how they approached the text in the medieval period. After that, there's some technical discussion about different manuscript traditions and which text of the glossa that Dr. Klumpenauer used to translate. And then you come to the prologue. So this is where this would be kind of like in a modern commentary, the introduction, but these are all insights from medieval interpreters. And so even the way it's printed on the page is really nice. It's two colors, it's red and black. So the paragraph markers are all in red, and it will have the contributor and what they're saying in each paragraph. So this one is something that Augustine said, and here's something that Jerome said. These are all introductory comments about the book of Genesis. There are notes that reflect some of the medieval mystical traditions. And then we come to the first page. And like the Latin glossa original, this is laid out to mimic it, but in English. So I'll hold this close so you can see. So you have chapter 1 of Genesis, and the biblical text is in this red kind of Gothic looking font. So you can see it there with the big I. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That is the biblical text, I believe, of the Douay Rheims, the Vulgate translation. And you can also see in between the lines of the biblical text, there are little notations. There are little crosses and other paragraph looking marks. Those point you then to the text on the outside of the page, where it's filled out in more detail. And if I've understood Klumpenauer from the introduction correctly, the glossa was used primarily in teaching settings. So you would have someone standing, because remember, this is long before personal editions of books were even remotely a possibility for your average reader. So you would have a lectern, a person who's teaching, the head of a monastic order, a professor, some kind of scholarly role would be standing at the podium reading from scripture, and the notes there were put so that they could quickly add in insights as they were reading through the text to the students and those gathered who were listening. And then if they needed to jump out and explain it more fully from what the medieval exegetes believed and sort of where the church as a whole was coming from, then that's what the notes on the sides were for. I believe that's how this was originally used. And so some of the pages, you can see this is the next part of Genesis. This is just verse 2, and then this is just verse 3. There's a few of these notations between the text, and then this is all medieval commentary. So you have a lot of thoughts by people like Bede and Strabo and Augustine, Jerome. So you have all of these medieval interpretive voices sort of collected together, compiled into one volume that you could follow as you're reading through the text of Genesis. And again, it's beautifully laid out. It's very easy to see the text. It has that medieval aesthetic to it. The pages are thick. These aren't like onion skin pages. Some of the passages, there is less annotation depending on what's going on in Genesis at that point. Remember, this is all the book of Genesis. Here's chapter 28. There's only 2 quick annotations there. In this section from Genesis 31, there's only 1. But there are all of these glosses sprinkled throughout that sort of give a little bit more meaning to the text or explain terms that may be a little bit unclear, so that as the reader, the teacher, the expositor is going through, they can note them at a glance. And it's the whole book of Genesis. So as I said, I'm not a medieval theologian. I'm not even a historical theologian. This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. However, as somebody who focuses on Old Testament, in particular the Pentateuch, this is really cool. Having medieval theologians and expositors' thoughts on Genesis in one volume, very cool idea. If you are into medieval theology, if you're into ancient Catholic theology, the traditions by which different eras in church history have read the text, this is a really cool resource. Honestly, it felt to me like a medieval European Catholic version of something like the Midrashim, like Genesis Rabbah, the rabbinic thoughts on Genesis, where they really pour into specific words, even down to why was this letter used and not this letter, or this word that appears here also appears there, therefore these are connected, or what is the mystical meaning or the true spiritual meaning other than just the literal meaning. It reads kind of similar in that regard. but from a medieval Western European perspective. Most of the insights, I think all of the insights in here that I saw come from Western church fathers rather than the Greek-speaking Eastern church. So you don't have a lot of the voices that may be elevated in Greek Orthodox tradition. This does seem to be a Latin Western tradition. But it's pretty fascinating just from a historical perspective. It's pretty insightful in terms of a historical theology perspective, and it's beautifully laid out in terms of a graphic design perspective. So I appreciate Dr. Klumpenhauer sending me this copy to check out. And so if this kind of stuff interests you, then this would be worth you grabbing a copy as well. Now, in the introduction, he does note that there have been some other more modern attempts at doing what the glossa set out to do, which is collating the thoughts of ancient interpreters. And I want to share two of them with you. One you've seen before, one I'm not sure if I've mentioned before, but I want you to be aware of these resources, especially those of you that really are interested in the historical side of biblical interpretation. The first is the CSB Ancient Faith Study Bible. I've reviewed this here on the channel, so we're not going to go into a review or anything like that. Click the link in the video description if you want to see an in-depth Disciple Dojo Study Bible review of the CSB Ancient Faith Study Bible. In addition to that, there's a larger set. I believe it's like 29 volumes. Here are the first two from InterVarsity. This is the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. So if you ever see abbreviation ACCS in a commentary or in a journal article, it's probably talking about this. And these two volumes are on the book of Genesis. But this does what the glossa did with medieval interpreters. The net is just a little wider here. And this was edited by modern biblical scholars. In this case, Mark Sheridan, and Thomas Oden is the general editor. So what the editors of the IVP series have done, and I have more on the shelf. I don't have all the volumes, but I have probably like a dozen or so. They lay the text out like a commentary. I will show you what this looks like just so you can get a comparison of this with the glossa. So the Ancient Christian Commentary series, you have an introduction that tells you how it came about, what it is. Then you have a guide on how to use it. And then you have, similar to the glossa, you have an introduction to Genesis. In this case, because this volume is just Genesis 1 through 11, you have the introduction to Genesis 1 through 11. So this would be a standard commentary type introduction, but focusing on how the medieval and the early church fathers read the text and the insights that they brought to it. And so then you come to the actual commentary. And whereas the glossa had the passage in the middle and columns on the side, in InterVarsities, they have the passage at the top. You can see that. And rather than the Douay Rheims, they're using the Revised Standard Version of the text. Then at the beginning of each section, there's an overview that sort of explains, these are how the big names, so to speak, Augustine, Basil, Origen, Chrysostom, these are how they approached this section of the text overall. And then the following pages are two columns layouts, and these are the actual passages from their works. And then at the end, it'll cite the work that it's from. So here you have Genesis 1-2. You have the RSV notes sprinkled throughout. You have an overview of how the early church fathers interpreted this verse. And then you have a couple of pages of excerpts from the works of these church fathers on this particular verse. And then in the next section, you have Genesis 1, verses 3 through 5. Same thing. And so laying them out side by side, you can compare the format. You can see the difference. The IVP series is not intending to evoke the aesthetic of a medieval manuscript tradition, whereas the glossa absolutely is, and it shows. So I just wanted to mention a couple of these resources, especially because a lot of my viewers are Protestants. And for better or for worse, and I'm a Protestant as well, for better or for worse, Protestants have a weird habit of sort of pretending that biblical exposition started at the Reformation and sort of ignoring or maybe giving lip service to the first 1500 years of biblical interpretation. So resources like these are helpful, especially for my fellow Protestants who want a fuller understanding of basically what was going on in church history as people were reading the Bible long before modern scholarship, the invention of the printing press, the Bible being translated into popular vernacular language. And most people aren't going to take a seminary level church history class. So resources like these, I think, are a helpful supplement. The good thing about church history based stuff is that almost all of it is freely available online because it's in the public domain. So if you want to read the ante-Nicene, the Nicene, the post-Nicene church fathers, you can pretty easily find any of their works in digital format online. However, if you just want something quick, if you're building your library, you want something either digitally in Logos or Accordance, both platforms, I believe, have the IVP set available. If you have an interest in Genesis in particular, then you definitely want to check out the Glossa. I don't know if there will be more volumes forthcoming. It would be pretty cool to see the rest of it, but as of right now, this is the only one that I know that's available. So as always, here at Disciple Dojo, we just want to help bridge the gap between the academy and everyday interested Bible readers. So I wanted to make you aware of these resources. Check them out. I'll put links to all of them in the description below. As always, if you appreciate our study Bible reviews or any of our other types of reviews or any of the other content here on the channel, the best way you can show that appreciation is by subscribing and clicking that notifications icon and by sharing Disciple Dojo videos with other people. So that's all for now. Stay tuned for much more here in the coming weeks at Disciple Dojo. We have some really cool stuff coming up that I can't really speak about yet. So you definitely want to subscribe so that you don't miss it. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep training.